Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Sonali.
Senate Democrats slammed a Republican bid to block President Obama's signature foreign policy nuclear deal with Iran. In a vote of 58 to 42, Democrats and independent senators banded together on Thursday to prevent the GOP from getting a filibuster-proof 60 votes to advance a resolution blocking the Iran nuclear deal. The vote marks a major victory for the Obama administration, which worked hard to lobby every lawmaker, despite the GOP-dominated House planning its own vote and Senate Republicans planning a re-vote next week. The opposition to the bill is unlikely to prevail. According to the New York Times, Republicans will use Mr. Obama's triumph, as they did with the healthcare law, as a means to attack Democrats in anticipation of next year's election. The agreement means that Iran will stop pursuing nuclear weapons capabilities in exchange for the lifting of crippling sanctions, although House Speaker John Boehner warned, "We will use every tool at our disposal to stop, slow, and delay this agreement from being fully implemented. Mr. Obama can begin removing sanctions against Iran as early as next week." Well, Cristina, many anti-war groups had lobbied for such a diplomatic effort. Is this a victory for progressives?
Well, I think the answer is a complicated one. On the one hand, it definitely can be seen as progress on the diplomacy side. I think that part of that is a debate between soft and hard power continues to show that hard power, including economic factors like sanctions, don't actually work. So that instead of the continuation of hard power, the U.S. would do better to employ more diplomatic efforts. But I think here's where we need to complicate this deal. And I wonder if anyone is asking questions that would actually reveal some of the roots of the question of nuclear weapons. So we have to remember, for instance, that the U.S. itself still has active nuclear warheads. So we want the U.S. and other nations that also have active nuclear warheads, and by the way, participate in everyday violence against people abroad, to limit the nuclear capabilities of Iran. I think there's some holes here that definitely need to be analyzed more.
Pope Francis is planning a 3-day visit to Cuba next week, and in preparation, the government of President Raul Castro has said it will release 3,500 prisoners as a goodwill gesture. Some inmates were due to be released next year anyway, and those people imprisoned for crimes against state security will remain behind bars, which rules out some high-profile dissidents. The Pope will arrive in Havana ahead of his highly anticipated visit to the U.S. He was apparently instrumental behind the scenes in fostering a resumption of diplomatic ties between the U.S. and Cuba. Despite Cuba's communist ideals, the Catholic Church has a strong presence on the island. If his health permits, the ailing Fidel Castro may also meet with Pope Francis. Cuban opposition to the Castro regime in the U.S. is critical of Pope Francis's silence on what they see as human rights violations. Cristina, this Pope has shown that he can be a major player on international policy. Is that a good thing?
Well, again, I think another complicated answer. So you have the Pope, who has shown that he's been on the right side of some issues. So in that sense, it is helpful to have his influence on international policy, especially in the case of U.S.-Cuba relations. But do we want to rely on the Pope? Maybe not, right? So there's a long history of persecution, oppression, human rights violations by the Catholic Church itself in Latin America. So I think that's an important part of history that shouldn't be forgotten. After all, it plays a big part in where Latin America is today. And of course, the Castros are very well aware of this history, since they have defied the church themselves in the past.
And finally, here in the United States, in a surprise move, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, has been dealt a major blow to its approval of a class of bee-killing pesticides, despite many studies pointing to the role of so-called neonicotinoids to bee colony collapse disorder. The EPA had approved the pesticides, and so a federal appeals court on Thursday struck down that approval specifically for one pesticide called sulfoxaflor. According to Mother Jones, the court cited the precariousness of bee populations and flawed and limited data submitted by Dow on the pesticide's effects on beleaguered pollinating insects. Dow Chemicals and Bayer are among the top manufacturers of the pesticide. Beekeepers, scientists, and environmentalists have been warning the EPA for years against the use of such neonicotinoids. Well, Cristina, this court actually demanded the EPA apply the precautionary principle, that is, prove something is safe before you allow it, rather than what it usually does, which is allow it until proven unsafe. How important is this decision?
Well, we know that the few, I should say, multinational agricultural companies that exist, for instance, Monsanto is one of them, have been employing their own scientists to produce research that often benefits the corporation itself. And all too often, the EPA has followed along approving varying degrees of levels of hormones in milk and food products, for example. So what we're seeing is finally an example where real independent research is showing us how uncertain and dangerous our agricultural economy is. And it's also important to see that it's not correct to say that something is better and safe if you can't prove the effects. Not knowing the short-term and or long-term effects of our products have on living species is actually more dangerous. So hopefully we can continue this trend.
Cristina, I always appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is our daily Newsflash guest expert on Fridays. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. When we come back, a September 11th anniversary special. Stay tuned.